The sound came first, a sharp, high laugh that cut through the cement dust like a knife. Then the dull, punishing thud of sacks hitting the concrete. Hands, cracked, calloused, brave, gripped the coarse rope. The rope bit into the skin. The air smelled of lime and sun-baked sweat. For a moment, everything reduced to weight, rope, and the small, stubborn man beneath it all. He was 67. His name was Don Roberto. He wore an old cap, its brim softened by years of oil and rain. His shoulders were bent not just from age, but from a lifetime of carrying things that had nothing to do with his back: grief, responsibility, quiet promises. Today he carried 100 kilos of cement tied into 2 sacks. People watched. Some counted the trips like a cruel game. The boss laughed. It happened in Guadalajara, on a mid-morning that promised heat. The site hummed with machines and voices, the city beyond the walls a mixture of traffic and church bells. On the scaffolding, Alejandro Mendoza stood with his arms folded, a planner's fury in a neatly pressed shirt. His boots were clean. His watch flashed gold when he moved his wrist. He had the look of someone used to being obeyed. His laugh rolled down to the workers like a verdict. Roberto's hands remembered other weights. They remembered a plane of walnut that had once been his pride, a bench he'd built with his own hands for Mariana, his wife. The bench had sat on the small patio of their home, weathered now, a place where the two of them used to sit and plan small, steady joys: birthdays for grandchildren, a new window, a sealed roof. He had sold the plane and the last of his chisels months ago, a transaction of necessity, coins clinking in the palm of a buyer who smelled of motor oil. He had watched his tools go into someone else's van, and for a moment felt as though he had boxed up more than metal. Memories arrive like smells: Mariana's soup on a rainy night, the way she would hum while sweeping, the small hand she would place on his when the night was cold. She had been the quiet north of his life. Without her, the compass spun. Her photograph sat at home on a shelf next to a cheap radio. He would touch the frame sometimes, just to prove to himself a memory could still be anchored. After she died, the house didn't get smaller so much as louder. Their son Fernando began to drift like wind. At first the family whispered about stress and long nights at work. Then the whispers named a bottle that had become a companion. Fernando, once a bright boy who'd run barefoot to show his father the new stools he made, had become a man who left doors unlocked and promises unpaid. He would call at strange hours, apologies slurred, then no calls at all. Roberto would leave a portion of his meager wage by the door, telling himself that love likes to be practical. The grandchildren were a small, steady light. Sophia, 8, with a braid that always came undone by lunch. Diego, 10, who liked to copy his grandfather's tools with sticks. They came after school to the tiny home on the corner where Don Roberto kept a pot always warm and a tomato plant that leaned toward the sun. They learned to make tortillas at his side, learned to tie an apron. Sophia would press her small face to his and ask, "Abuelo, will Papa come back for dinner?" His answer was the same gentle thing he told himself every night: "We wait, we keep the table set." It is easy to heroize small acts until they become ordinary. Every morning, Roberto left before dawn, before the city had fully woken, catching the overcrowded bus with his blue thermos. He arrived at the site, hands already stiff from the cold and the exertion of a life that had counted every peso carefully. He worked with Jorge, who was younger by 3 decades, and who had a way of watching the world's edges that made him sympathetic. Jorge saw what most at the site pretended not to see: the way Roberto ate alone in a corner, the way his shoulders tensed when Alejandro passed. Alejandro was not always cruel, though that was easy to forget when he smiled with the power of a man who had never had to ask for mercy. He had come into the business with a white-collar education and a zeal for efficiency. Where others saw people, he saw numbers. Where others saw labor, he saw a schedule to be met. When deadlines stacked, Alejandro's temper sharpened. He liked to test limits. He liked to make an example. On a Tuesday that felt ordinary until it wasn't, Alejandro called all the men together. A clipboard, a new plan, a tight timeline. "Extra sacks," he said, fingers tapping the printed page. "We need the cement shifted before midday. Whoever finishes fastest gets the bonus. You," he said, pointing at Roberto, "you take the double load." There was a pause, an intake of breath that felt like a held prayer. It was not the work itself that startled the men. Many had carried heavy loads before. It was the weight Alejandro set. 2 sacks tied as one, 100 kilos in total. It was the time he imposed. Cut the trips in half, move faster, or don't come back tomorrow. His eyes were sharp as the clip on his wallet. "Are you sure, Senor Alejandro?" Jorge said, a protest that tried to be gentle. "He's old, Alejandro smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "We all have families," he said. "We all find a way. Don Roberto is strong. Old men can surprise you." The sentence hung there, a kind of commandment in its own right. His laugh came after, low and confident. "Besides, if he can't, we'll hire someone who can." The men shuffled. Roberto felt his chest tighten. He could think of 100 reasons to refuse, of pain and of dignity, of pride that said this was not the measure of a man. But he thought of Sofia and Diego. He thought of the little house and the radio and the face of Maria Elena in the photograph. He thought of the way Fernando had once smiled at him with real warmth, before the bottle. He thought of the tortilla waiting and of the voice of his dead wife telling him once, soft, always, "We feed them, we keep them safe." So he nodded. "Fine," he said. His voice was quiet. It felt thin like the thin air of the early morning. It held the weight of the agreement like molten metal. Later, when he told himself the story once more, the first trip would blur with the second. In the moment, each trip was a small universe of sensation. The rope burned his palms. The sacks shook with a sound like old bones. When he lifted, his knees complained, and his lower back flared with a pain that had lived in him for years. The sun struck the tops of the beams, and the shadow of the scaffold passed across his hands like a slow clock. On the first trip, he managed, step by step, with breaths counted and a prayer breathed between them. There were practical calculations, where to place the sacks, the angle to hold the rope, but mostly there was insistence. Jorge handed him a cloth to protect his hands. Around them voices rose and fell, the clink of an iced bottle, a muttered bet on whether he would finish. The second time, the rope dug deeper. His fingers numbed. The crowd around the pile thickened. Some shook their heads, some watched with that mixture of curiosity and cruelty that humans reserve for the suffering of others. Alejandro watched like a spectator at a match, arms folded, a stopwatch at hand, the whisper of money or dismissal in his mouth like a hidden coin. By the third trip, everything compressed. Heat became a physical presence, pressing down so that breath felt like an act of will. The concrete was scorching against his soles. Sweat threaded into his hair, into his beard. The rope felt suddenly heavier than rope. It felt like memory. He thought of Maria Elena's small hands pushing away his hair during a fever. He thought of Diego running a stick along the floorboards, pretending to craft a toy. He thought of Sofia drawing a sun with too many rays. He thought of Fernando's laugh years ago, bright as a bell. On that third trip, his legs betrayed him. A step caught on a loose stone. The sacks tilted like a seesaw. For the first time, the weight shifted. Not the world's weight, but the sum of lifetimes. That old, exquisite, collapsing moment. He made a sound then, a sound that was not quite a curse and not quite a prayer. Jorge moved to help, but Alejandro raised his hand, cutting him off as cleanly as a blade. "Let him finish," Alejandro said, voice hard. "We need to see he can do it." Someone in the crowd laughed. It was the laugh he had heard at the beginning, rolled back now like a ball in the center of a cruel room. The laugh was a punctuation mark, a small triumphant thing that wanted to drive like a stake. He fell forward. Dust lifted. The sacks landed with a thud that seemed to echo. For a moment, the world narrowed to the ringing in his ears and the taste of dust. The scaffold blurred. Hands, other hands, were at his shoulders. Faces leaned in, some shocked, some already having made the story of him in their heads. Alejandro arrived like a judge, stance wide, voice louder than the machines. "Well," he said, "are you done?" Roberto gasped. He could feel the skin on his palms ripped loose, a sting like a warning. Pain flared in his lower back and then settled like a bruise that would not be seen but would be known. He wanted to stand. He forced his fingers against the rough ground and pushed. Victory and humiliation are sometimes one and the same. They lift you up only to show how high you've had to climb. "You are safe," Jorge said, or maybe someone else. The words were small, but offered a scaffolding for him. Others muttered. A few men reached out, offering water or a jacket. Some stayed silent, looking away. Alejandro circled him like a hawk. "You should know your limits," he said. There was a slow, satisfied drawl in his voice, as if the man had just delivered a lesson he'd been paid to teach. "We'll make a note of how he performs. Maybe some of you will learn to keep up." A handful of workers clapped. Mock applause. The sound landed like thrown stones. Roberto felt the sting of it, but he also felt something less demonstrable. The deep, stubborn peace of a man who had chosen. He had chosen to carry, not because it made sense or because it elevated him, but because he had decided the children would not go to bed hungry. In the cheap light of a tin-roofed house, in the small kitchen where a narrow table kept the sum of their lives, he wanted the grandchildren to sleep on full stomachs and rise to the smell of coffee. That choice lived in him like a small, fierce lantern. There were small consequences, practical and humiliating. Alejandro docked his pay. He announced a new schedule. He made jokes about old tricks and old men doing young men's work. The men moved like they had to decide whether to side with mercy or with the power that fed their own families. The balance was delicate. The silence of those who chose to look away was its own verdict. At night, Roberto returned to a house that was both sanctum and battlefield. He cooked rice with frijoles, heated a can of tomatoes until the smell filled the room. Sofia and Diego were at the table, elbows on the scarred wood, their eyes bright with the day's small triumphs. They asked about his hands. He showed them the blisters. Sofia wrapped his fingers with a clean napkin and announced that she would be a doctor when she grew up. "Abuelo," she said, voice solemn, "you're my hero." He laughed, a small, brittle sound. "No," he said, "you have to be your own hero." But when she smiled back, he felt that old warmth that had kept him steady through the years. He watched them sleep that night, their faces untroubled, and let his breath slow. The house creaked, and the radio hummed low. The photograph of Maria Elena caught the moonlight and seemed alive. He pressed his palm there and felt again that tether of memory. The next morning, the worksite felt different. Alejandro had an edge now that was sharper. He introduced new rules with the casual cruelty of a man placing a wager. Efficiency, he called it, discipline. He walked between the men like a man who believed a stern eye would sculpt bones into obedience. On the site, small humiliations accumulate into a shape. A joke at the wrong time, a watch glanced at with impatience, a boss's hand that does not hesitate to point at one's shortcomings in front of strangers. Alejandro delighted in maiming faults. He liked to demonstrate how little personal credit fit under the weight of a ledger. To a man who had once been eligible for the city's small kindnesses, who had had a home, who had learned the trade of making and mending, every insult landed like a small cut. There was a particular day when Alejandro's escalation took on the fabric of cruelty. He had found a new way to make the men feel expendable. A small instruction given to all. Tighter deadline, double loads, no exceptions. His voice was level, and in it sat the clear commandment that this was how it had to be. For the younger men, the rule was a challenge. For the middle-aged, it was a nuisance. For Roberto, it was the kind of equation you solve with a body. He could not call in sick. There was no one to cover his hours, and no cushion to soften the fall. He had thought of talking to Alejandro, pleading a small mercy, but pleading had a cost that felt like a trade in shame. Pride can be a currency. So he tied the 2 sacks as instructed. The rope around them cut into his hands. Each twist and knot was an act of will. Jorge stood nearby, worry carved into his face. The other workers drifted like quiet waves, some whispering about the boss, some calculating how soon they could go for coffee. The work was a choreography repeated in endless loops. Lift, walk, place, return. Each loop shortened his breath a little more. The sun rose higher and turned the site into an oven. A boy from the neighboring block came by, clutching a small plastic cup of agua fresca. He watched with big eyes. When Diego heard about the sack, he pressed his small fist into his mouth and doubled his brow in concentrated worry, as though the world hung on his grandpa's success. On the 3rd lap, after the thud and the fall, something in the crowd began to change. The laughter hardened into a silence. Some faces that had been neutral folded in on themselves like paper. The sight felt too loud and then too small. Alejandro stepped forward, but the look on his face had shifted, something like triumph, or perhaps like fear masked as dominance. Roberto set his cheek to the coarse ground. The hot concrete pressed against his skin. For a moment, all movement in the sight felt distant, like echoes transmitted through thick water. He tasted the iron of the dust at the back of his throat. A sharp prick at his palm had become a brighter thread of pain. He tried to rise and found his knees less obliging. He pushed with the remnants of resolve and saw Alejandro's figure standing over him, arms crossed, watch gleaming like a small sun. "Get up," Alejandro said. His voice was a judge's. It expected obedience, not an explanation. Roberto's breath came in ragged slices. He looked up and met Alejandro's gaze. In that moment, something passed between them that was not merely boss and worker. It was the brief, sharp recognition that one life could be measured in a handful of moments that had nothing to do with money. Alejandro's past came like a flicker of film to the surface of his crisp composure. A boy in a small house, his father's shadow long across a cracked tile floor. A small boy who learned early that work meant worth. A child told he must never be weak lest he be despised. Alejandro had been taught to value strength as currency. The tightness around his mouth was not born only of the present. It had its roots in a father's hard gaze, in a childhood when affection was doled out as if it were a rare commodity. That memory, quick and hot, did not excuse him. It explained the way his voice found that sharper edge when he looked at another man's vulnerability. "You're lucky I don't fire you," he said. The words were intended to slice. They landed like a verdict. A few of the men shifted. Some made jokes to lighten the mood. Others stayed quiet. Jorge, square-shouldered and with a hands callus from the same years of labor, came close and helped Roberto to a sitting position. The neighboring boy ran off to fetch a small stick of ice to press to Roberto's palm. For Roberto, the humiliation was large but not defining. He felt it in the bones, yes, and the stinging in his palms. He felt the disgrace in the way some men averted their eyes. But there was also a seed that did not accept defeat. He had been a man who built things once. He had carried people's burdens in not grand gestures of fidelity. Cakes baked for birthdays, a radio repaired,
a roof mended after a storm. He had laid himself down to make other people's days possible. Today, he would carry one more load. When he finally made his way home, the house was dim and full of the ordinary things that meant the world to him. A pot simmered on the stove. The room smelled of garlic and onion, and the faint perfume of soap that had belonged to Maria Elena. The children greeted him like small triumphant kings, all the problems of the day temporarily displaced by the warmth of home. He kissed Sophia's head and Diego's cheek. They did not see the docked wage or the ache in his back. They only saw their grandfather, who had come home. That night he lay awake longer than usual.
Noise from the neighborhood pulsed like a city heartbeat. A distant radio played a slow bolero. He could hear the house settling. He could also hear a small voice inside him that asked whether he had given too much. The answer was immediate and firm. He had given what was needed. He had given his hands, his time, his pride. This is what love sometimes requires, he thought. Days became a series of small tests. Alejandro's watch seemed an instrument of measuring human adequacy. Each dawn brought new demands. The worksite felt less like a place of honor and more like a place of arbitration. The men whispered about what Alejandro might do next. Rumors made rounds. He'll ask more. He'll cheapen pay further. He'll hire different men. In the quiet of his own mind, Roberto rehearsed possibilities. A different job, a different town, a different life. But options are expensive, and the city has a way of shutting doors softly and without notice. One afternoon, a week after the collapse, Alejandro came down to the pile with a new plan. His voice carried a certain performance. He wanted to see who would stand under pressure. He wanted to separate those who could be pushed and those who could not. The task was cruel in its clarity. Move the sacks twice as fast. If not, there would be consequences. Less pay, fewer hours, the implicit threat that you could be replaced. Roberto stood in the shade and watched Alejandro make a small show of authority. The men looked at each other with the same distant look that people wear when they think about what their children will need. Jorge came up and put a hand on Roberto's shoulder. Jorge's hand was small and warm. "You don't have to do everything," Jorge insisted, quietly. "You could walk away." Roberto turned his face to the sun. "And leave them hungry?" he replied. "If I leave, who will feed them?" Jorge's jaw tightened. It was the answer he expected and the answer he hated. It was the kind of question that does not admit an easy solution. That evening, when he reached home, Sophia had a small paper taped to the refrigerator, a drawing she had made at school. It showed a stick figure with a broad smile and a cap. Above it, in a child's careful scrawl, were the words, "Mi abuelo es fuerte." My grandfather is strong. Roberto traced the letters with a thumb worn by years of work. Strength, he understood, had a different language in the mouths of children. It did not always mean the ability to lift the heaviest object. Sometimes it meant the choice to hold steady for someone else. The day it became public humiliation was a day heavy with sun. Alejandro had decided, as bosses sometimes do, to make an example. He gathered the men with the performance-like air of a man announcing a spectacle. "Whoever wants to stay," he said, "will show they can meet the standard." The standard, he made clear, was not just about moving sacks. It was about proving a point. A man who is humiliated is a man who stands in the open for other men to test their own courage and their own fear. Roberto tied the 2 sacks again. The rope's fibers bit into his hands. He tasted the dust. The first trip went like a memory he had already lived. The second trip was heavier. On the third, his knees wavered. He misstepped, stumbled, and the world tipped. When he fell, the sound of the sacks hitting the concrete was like a small explosion. Dust rose in a silent cloud that stung eyes. The laughter began as it had at the start of this story, a sharp sound that liked the taste of another's misfortune. Alejandro's laugh carried the day with it. Hands reached for him, some to help, some to gawk. He heard a voice he recognized from childhood, a voice he had once known as his wife's. Hush. Hush as in comfort. Hush as in calling the attention back to what matters. Breath, dignity, small, necessary acts. The workers in the crowd forced their faces into a kind of normality. Some were embarrassed by their own participation in the design. Alejandro stepped closer, narrowed his eyes, and looked down at Roberto the way a man looks at a machine he intends to replace. "You should know better," he said. The words were not just an order, they were a verdict. The moment stretched. There was a small hush, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Roberto felt something thin inside him give way in a way that was not purely physical. There was a shame, yes, but there was also an odd, luminous clarity. He knew what he had done. He had chosen. The choice held him upright more than the flaccid strength of his legs. A voice came then, soft and distant, like a voice you hear in the half-light between sleep and waking. It was not a prayer declared in the big rooms of faith. It was an arrangement of syllables that had always lived in him. "Forgive me and help us." He did not know how to say the rest. He closed his eyes and held the taste of the dust like a sacrament. Above the din, someone clapped, this time not mockingly, but uncertainly, like a man who does not know which side to take. The clapping made no sound that mattered. At home that night, after he had cleaned his wounds with water and wrapped his palms, he found a letter tucked under the magnet on the fridge. It was from a neighbor who had seen the day. The neighbor had written that he was ashamed of the laughter, that he had been elsewhere when the house needed its voice, and that he would bring tortillas to the children the next day. A small kindness. It was not grand. It tasted whole. But the shame and the kind acts and the docked wages conspired to create a shape inside Roberto that was at once heavy and strangely buoyant. He thought of Maria Elena, of how she had taught him that dignity is something you carry with your hands and with your heart. He thought of his son and felt the ache of disappointed expectation. He thought of his grandchildren who slept like small planets in their beds. He could not fix everything. He could only carry what he could carry. On the morning of the next assignment, Alejandro's eyes held a particular, eager fixity. The men felt it, a new edge. He had announced a bonus if a certain quota was reached, a small extra that would not change a life but might ease a week. Alejandro had always loved small economies of reward and punishment. It focused people. It divided them. Roberto walked to the pile of sacks and felt his palms go numb in a familiar way. The town seemed extra loud that day. The honk of a horn, a vendor calling out mangoes, a child's shout in the distance. The scaffolding threw a long shadow across his back, and for a second he was a small man swallowed by a larger thing. Alejandro's hand tapped against the clipboard. "Make it twice as fast," he said. "Prove your worth." The crowd leaned in. Jorge mouthed a prayer under his breath. Some men who had laughed earlier now clenched their jaws and looked away. The day seemed to hold a slow, tide-like inevitability. Either this would break him, or he would stand. He made the first trip. He made the second. On the third, his foot slipped on a loose shard of concrete. The rope cut into his skin. The sacks went down with a thud like thunder. He hit the ground. This time, the sound of the fall was not followed immediately by laughter. Instead, there was a heavy quiet. For a long moment, no one moved. It was as if the city had decided to witness instead of entertain. Then someone breathed. Someone else wept quietly for a shame that was not theirs, but that they were suddenly unable to avoid. Alejandro looked down. Something unreadable passed over his face. Perhaps he imagined himself in the place of the fallen man. Perhaps a memory rose, as it sometimes will,
unbidden, the slap of a father, the look of a mother who had taught him to hide weakness. For a blink there was confusion. Then the mask of the boss slipped back into place. "Get him up," Alejandro said, voice more measured, but with a hardness that suggested this was not kindness, but discipline in disguise. "There will be no more delays. We have a schedule." Hands reached. Someone steadied his head. Someone offered water. The neighbor boy, who had been watching like spyglass eyes, brought a thin rag. The children, Sofia and Diego, sat on the stoop that night worrying over the same question. Had their abuelo been humiliated? Their worry was raw and honest, and it cut more sharply than the docked wage. Roberto sat at the table and looked at the radio and at the photograph of Maria Elena. He held the photograph and remembered the feel of her hand. He told himself a story he had told himself for years, that loyalty is not always applause. Sometimes it is the stained hands at the end of a long day that prove the most. When sleep came, it was broken, shallow and peppered with the recent pain.
At some point in the small hours, he rose and stepped out into the alley behind the house. The night carried a thin breeze that smelled faintly of jasmine and municipal dust. He sat on the little bench he had built years ago and ran his hand over the splintered wood until his fingers found a familiar groove. He was old enough to know that life does not owe him anything. He was old enough to accept that sometimes courage is not rewarded in this life with what the heart expects. He was, in a particular and private way, full of hope because he loved two small children. The hope had weight. It also had teeth. As the sun broke the horizon, painting the roofs with a soft ochre, he thought of the next day's work. He tied the bandage on his palm more tightly. He would go. He had to go. There were bills and mouths to feed, and a stubborn belief that the world could be coaxed into kindness with enough insistence. When he walked away from the bench and approached the main road, he felt the smallness of himself and the vastness of what he owed. The city was waking. The day would demand more. At the construction site that morning, the air was thick in a way that had little to do with temperature. Men moved. Alejandro surveyed them with the cool satisfaction of someone who believes that order and pressure will produce results. His hand brushed the crisp shirt at his chest. His watch glinted like a tiny lighthouse. He liked the way the men adjusted their behavior to please him. It confirmed his belief that he mattered. Roberto tied the sacks, slinging the rope over his shoulders with the practiced motion of a life that has always known how to prepare for work. He thought of the kids. He thought of the sound of Sofia's small voice saying he was strong. And he thought, too, of a small thing his wife had once said. Sometimes the world will not see you. Sometimes you must carry yourself for the ones you love. Those words were a kind of covenant. He lifted. He walked. The first step was always a prayer. Step by step, he moved through the sun-washed day, and the men watched. On the third trip, the world contracted. A loose stone, a sudden lurch. He stumbled. The sacks crashed to the ground. He fell to his knees and then to the concrete. This time, the fall was more than physical. It was as if decades of apologies and endurance had pooled into a single, visible gesture. The crowd parted like water. Alejandro leaned forward, face set. "Is he done?" he asked, the words thick with an expectation of failure. Jorge moved to help him up, but there was a pause, a long heartbeat in which the construction site, the city, and the small house waited to see what would happen next. Roberto looked up. Dust had painted his cheeks. He could see Alejandro's reflection in the gold of his watch. He could feel the urge to rise and to prove, again, that strength need not be measured by the number of sacks one can carry. There was, simultaneously, a low hum beneath all things, like the city preparing to exhale. He pushed himself to his elbows, then to his feet. His hands trembled.
A small crowd watched, some with pity, some with curiosity, some with that indifference that only other people can show when they do not wish to see pain. He steadied himself and felt a swirl inside that was not merely physical. It was a question: what is dignity if the world tracks you by your capacity to carry? He breathed. The heat of the sun pressed down. Alejandro watched like a man who knew his voice could shape the world. "Keep going," he said. "Finish what you started." Roberto glanced at Jorge, then at the rope. The world reduced to rope, hands, and the hum of a watch. He wrapped his fingers around the coarse fibers and felt them burn his skin. He lifted. Each step was a small victory and a small expense. On the edge of the crowd, a boy watched with an intensity that held the promise of memory. He would remember this afternoon for years. He might not know why, but memory keeps the small as true moments like seeds. For now, his small hand clutched a cheap toy truck, and his eyes followed each motion as if watching a miracle in the making. And then, as he struggled forward, a sound rose. It was not a laugh this time. It was a low, elliptical thing, an intake that felt like the city itself had drawn air. For a long second, nothing else existed. Only the man, the weight, and the watchful faces. The world tightened. Roberto felt the braid of rope in his hands as if it were a lifeline and an accusation. He had been carrying so much already: grief, memory, the burden of being the strong one, that the physical weight suddenly felt like a metaphor come to life. His knees trembled. The concrete underfoot seemed to want to claim him. He breathed and stepped. Then he fell. Then he fell. Time folded inward like a pressed handkerchief. For a few heartbeats, the sight held its breath. Dust hung thick and still, catching the late light and turning the world into a watercolor blur. Men shifted their weight from one foot to the other, as if that small motion could move them from witness to actor. Alejandro's stopwatch glittered at his side, but its ticking felt suddenly irrelevant, an instrument of order that had been interrupted by something none of them could tally. Roberto lay on the concrete with the taste of grit in his mouth and his palms burning as if they carried the sun itself. He could hear the faint, compassionate rustle of Jorge's jacket as Jorge leaned in, the scrape of a boot, the soft, uneven breaths of those around him. He heard Sofia's voice in his head, small and insistent: "Mi abuelo es fuerte." He wanted, more than anything, to stand for them and to be ordinary again. Pride pressed at him like a tide. "Someone fetch water," someone said. The command meant help, and help leaned in the form of hands that wanted to be useful. A neighbor boy slipped an ice cube into Jorge's shirt and watched the man's face for proof that cold could make the sting go away. Small kindnesses gathered around him like moths to a lamp. Then the air changed. It was not a thunderclap nor a trumpet fanfare. It was subtler. A soft hush, as if the city had taken a long, surprised inhale. The machines at the far edge of the site kept their rumble, but other noises thinned. The breeze shifted and carried a scent that did not belong to concrete or diesel, a fresher kind of air, cool as a hand placed on a fevered brow. The sunlight seemed to alter, not in intensity, but in the way it set people inside their own skin, making edges sharper, hearts more honest. A man had appeared on the perimeter as if he had been there all along. He wore simple clothing, a worn jacket, plain shoes. He looked like someone who walked the streets without needing to be noticed. And yet, when he stepped into the pool of light near Roberto, the crowd parted with a weird deference. He moved slowly, not in the rush of a passerby, but in the deliberate pace of someone who measured his steps by other people's pain. He did not come with fanfare. He came with a presence that settled rooms, the kind of presence that quieted arguing mice and soothed restless infants. His face was neither theatrical nor striking by worldly standards, but there was something in his eyes that made the men shift as if an old ledger had been balanced. He knelt beside Roberto with a gentleness that did not demean. "Roberto," the stranger said, his voice small enough to be intimate and large enough to be heard. It held no accusation. It held recognition. The name, spoken in that tone, landed like a benediction. Roberto blinked. He had not known the man, and yet the sound of his name as this man spoke it moved something inside him like a key nudging a lock. He opened his mouth to answer and found he had no words that fit the current shape of the world. Alejandro, still standing with the hard edge of authority, looked on, suspicion knitting his brows. The man's gaze turned toward him, and, without flinching, the stranger said his name as well, Alejandro. The name clipped across the air, and in its utterance something like a film strip flashed in Alejandro's chest, an image he had not meant to show anyone. For a moment the boss's composure frayed. A small child in a kitchen, a father's hand too heavy, a silence that felt like a door closing. The flash was a private thing, a memory that should have remained locked, and yet here it was, exposed by a voice that seemed to know. The sight grew even quieter. Even Alejandro's laugh, which had before served as a kind of punctuation, dropped as if somebody had put a lid on it. The men's faces shifted from curiosity to something deeper, recognition that a moment had arrived that would not be measured by schedules or bonuses. The stranger's eyes softened as he looked at Roberto.
He reached, not with grand gestures, but with a touch that felt like coming home, and placed a cool palm lightly on Roberto's forehead. The contact was not theatrical. It was like a question and an answer in the same motion. "Child of Maria Elena," the man said. It was not a reading of genealogies, but a tenderness that identified him to his history. The name of Roberto's wife, soft, beloved, moved through Roberto as if a breeze had passed through a long shuttered room. Roberto's fingers curled reflexively. For the first time that day, he felt the ache shift, not disappear in a miraculous puff, but rearrange itself inside him so that breath returned easier. The burning in his palms dulled to a manageable, apologetic throb. The agony in his lower back loosened like a tightened rope undoing. He tried to speak. The stranger smiled, and the smile held both pity and an affirmation. "You do not bear this alone," he said. The sentence was simple and direct, and it told truths Roberto had not allowed himself to say aloud. Alejandro's arms folded, but his face, something about it, began to crack. He had been taught to rely on the discipline of efficiency as though it were a moral law. He had been taught to reward strength and punish weakness. His training in life had not left much room for tender acts. He flushed as if heat had risen under his shirt. The stranger's words were not condemnation, but a mirror. They reflected back to Alejandro the small boy who had learned that belonging came only by performance. "You have been hurt," the man said to Alejandro, and his voice carried the careful mercy of one who names pain without excusing wrong. "You were taught to preserve yourself by making others prove they are enough, but that is not the way of life." Something in Alejandro responded, not a theatrical repentance, but a human recoil that rippled to his core. The man had spoken of him as if he were known, and that recognition mattered more than 1,000 reports or meetings. For a man built on approval, he had never imagined that his wounds would be seen. He swallowed, and the sound was audible, a small animal noise of surprise. "Why?" Alejandro managed to say, and the word was not an accusation, but the guttural question of someone whose moral map had been unsettled. He did not know why this stranger had stopped beside a fallen worker instead of looking past him. He felt suddenly exposed, the ruler of his little kingdom put into someone else's hand. The stranger's eyes did not swerve. "Because he was carrying what others had abandoned," the man answered. "Because his hands hold more than cement." He paused, letting the meaning hang there like a small bright lamp. "Because I come where those who are overlooked are." His voice, when he said it, had an authority that did not rely on shouting. It was a presence that invited honesty. When he spoke, the people around him seemed to remember how to listen to what mattered. Alejandro's jaw trembled. He had images return to him. His own father berating a tremor of weakness. His mother's eyes that never lingered long enough to provide comfort. He had crafted himself into a judge because it was the only role that assured him approval. Now a stranger named the wound and did not flinch. That bare fact was a challenge to the armor Alejandro had built. "Get up," Alejandro heard himself say, but the order had turned into something else, a plea thinly disguised. He walked forward as if to assert control, and found the ground unsteady beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with concrete. He did not know how to be other than the man who measured worth by output. The stranger rose slowly and looked at Alejandro directly. "You can choose differently," he said. The words were a question that also felt like an offer. It did not come with lists of rules or the threat of punishment. It came as a possibility, a small door opening where there had been a wall. Alejandro's face fell. Tears came quick and surprising. He blinked them away with clumsy, self-conscious motions. For a moment he became very small in the face of the truth. He had chosen to hurt to feel less hurt. The admission made him dizzy, like stepping from a porch into a blinding light. Roberto, meanwhile, felt the last of the burning recede from his hands. Not a dramatic disappearance, but a soft unwinding, the way knots set for years sometimes loosen when someone knows the right place to press. He sat up with Jorge's help, and the stranger remained beside him, watching with a steady calm. "You should not have been made to prove your worth with your body," the stranger told him. "You have been faithful where others turned away." Roberto's throat worked. He had been waiting, not for miracles maybe, but for someone, anyone, to notice. The stranger's voice seemed to acknowledge things without making them spectacles. It was as if the world had been given permission to be kinder. Alejandro's knees buckled as he sank onto a nearby crate. He made no pretense of dignity now. He put his face in his hands, and the sound he made, part sob, part laugh, was almost unbearable. Words spilled out, apologies unpracticed, old excuses. He looked at the men he managed and saw them not as ciphers, but as people with children and mothers and faded photographs on mantels. The realization was a sharp, inconvenient light. "What can I do?" he asked finally, not with the tone of a man asking to repair a printer, but with the honest desperation of someone who had harmed and wanted to begin to unmake what he had done. The stranger did not answer with a ledger of conditions. He leaned forward so his voice brushed Alejandro alone. "Start small," he said. "Pay back what you can. Speak the truth to those you hurt. Help him get home. Then listen, really listen, to why he works so hard." Alejandro's shoulders shook. He did the small, simple act the stranger had suggested. He reached, awkwardly, for his wallet. He took out a bill. Not a grand restitution, but an immediate gesture. He handed it to Roberto with hands that trembled visibly. I'll give you 2 days' pay," he stammered, "and the bonus." The sentence unraveled, and he could not finish. The men around him watched in a stunned, near-reverent stillness. Jorge placed a heavy hand on Alejandro's shoulder, a weight and a blessing both. The two men, one who had ordered humiliation, another who had endured it, met in that small, messy space where restitution starts, with a hand offered, with a person seen. The neighbor boy who'd watched the scene unfold went to fetch Sofia and Diego, who were waiting at home with the small, tender confidence children carry when they trust the adults in their world. When they arrived, they rushed in flurried steps, eyes wide. They saw Alejandro first, his cheeks wet, and Jorge leading Roberto by the elbow. For the children, the sight was raw and confusing, and strangely hopeful. Alejandro's apology was not a polished speech. It trembled, broke, and reassembled. He told them he was sorry. He asked nothing of forgiveness. He offered, plainly and clumsily, to feed the children for a week, to ensure the wage dock that had bitten at their cupboards that month was covered. It was a small start. It was also a painful, real act of humility. Roberto accepted the money, but more importantly, he accepted the attempt to repair. He clutched Alejandro's hand and looked at him without the triumph that might have made the moment sour. "We all have families," he said softly. "We all carry things." His voice did not boast. It asked for nothing grand. It simply invited mutual human dignity. The stranger, who had watched with a patience that felt ancient, smiled once and then stepped back. He looked at the workers and at the city beyond. Then he turned to the children and crouched to their level. His voice was soft and kind. "You are important," he told them. "You matter. Tell your father how you feel. Let him come home when he is ready. Hold your grandfather's hands with pride." Sofia, with her braid already coming undone, pressed her small fingers into the stranger's palm. She felt the warmth there as if it were sunlight gathered in a cupped hand. Diego, who mimicked tools with sticks, studied the stranger as if learning something like a new craft, how to look at a person and not measure them by usefulness. Then the stranger walked away as quietly as he had arrived, blending into the ordinary flow of people coming and going. He left no brand or public display. Men watched him go until he was a fading silhouette against the city's blue. The memory of that presence would act like an after-image in their minds, small, insistent, a thing they could return to on hard nights. Later, in the narrow kitchen where a single bulb threw warm, honeyed light, Roberto unwrapped his hands slowly. The deep abrasions had closed in ways that surprised him, not as if medical certainty had fixed everything overnight, but rather as if a pressure he had been under had been relieved enough for his body to take a breath and begin the slow work of mending. He flexed his fingers and felt a thin, thrumming hope. It was not a cure stated like a headline. It was a real, human relief. Alejandro did not transform into a saint in that instant. He left the site with hands that seemed lighter only because something heavy had been acknowledged. He spent the afternoon in a quiet that had the shape of thought. He wrote an awkward note to the men, an apology on paper, the sort of thing one makes when one is learning humility. He met with Jorge and Roberto and promised to revisit the hiring practices and the schedule. He did not claim he could erase months of hard deeds with a check or a speech. He knew restitution was a process, but he had opened a door. Word traveled, as words will, and the neighborhood took notice. The neighbor who had left a note came by the next morning with a bag of warm tortillas. He laughed awkwardly and said, "I am here now." Small acts like that followed. Someone offered spare tomatoes. Another offered to help with the roof for the day. The site's machines continued to hum, but beneath the hum something else was rearranging, a fragile, communal attention. In the weeks that followed, Roberto's life took on new small rhythms. The cuts and blisters on his hands healed with the patient mercy of time. He slept more soundly some nights, unburdened by the raw sting of immediate humiliation. Alejandro kept his promise in modest ways. A small pay correction, a scheduler who checked on elder workers when a project demanded extra strain, a willingness to listen, halting at first, then more steady. He did not become flawless. He became available for change. Fernando, Roberto's son, heard whispers on the street. He had been living in pockets of shame, avoiding the house and the names that tugged at him like ropes. He had avoided his father not out of cruelty, but because he was trapped inside his own worsening habits.
One afternoon, exhaustion and something like courage tugged him to the corner where his father fixed the radio. He stood in the doorway and listened. The sight of Alejandro, shabby with regret, handing over a small envelope to his father, cut through him in a strange way. He saw his own reflection in the gesture, a man who had been seen by others and had been offered a way to begin to repair. Fernando did not come clean all at once. He did not deliver grand proclamations. He came with a tentative apology and a request for bread. He admitted he was struggling. The first thing he did was sit at the table and eat with his children, an ordinary act loaded with new meaning. In time, he asked for help. He began attending a support group across town, a modest, small circle of people who shared his difficulties without judgment.
The path ahead was long and uncertain, and it remained true that not every step was guaranteed. But for the first time in months, perhaps years, there was movement forward. The community noticed the unassuming miracle of a changed tone. People who had once laughed at the site's edges now crossed streets to offer a hand. Others simply watched and reconsidered their own habits. The change did not erase hunger or need. It altered how they treated one another while those needs remained. That, to some of them, was itself a kind of healing. Months later, a small neighborhood meeting convened in the dusty church hall. Alejandro stood and told the story in his own halting way. He admitted how easy it had been to forget the humanity behind a task list. He spoke of the sting of being recognized as a man made of wounds and of the surprise of being invited to do better. The men listened, and then they shared. There was not a tidy moral. Their lives did not reform overnight, but there was a new willingness to watch one another's backs. Contracts were renegotiated in small ways that showed care, allowances for rest, a stronger check on who was being asked to overreach. Roberto continued to work. He returned to small carpentry projects when he could. Neighbors remembered his steady hands and asked him to fix a chair or a shutter. He regained a measure of his craft, not as a grand comeback, but as a quiet reclaiming of self. His pride did not bloom into vanity. It settled into a patient contentment. Sofia and Diego grew with a memory they would carry their whole lives, that their grandfather had been seen and that someone had come when he needed help the most. They learned, in the way children do, that courage had 1,000 shapes, not just in lifting heavy loads, but in staying at a table, in saying sorry, in tying an apron for another person. Those lessons lodged in them like seeds. The man who had come to the site, who had knelt and called Roberto by his wife's name, left traces beyond the immediate repairs. People began to speak differently about one another, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with grace. They began to measure their worth not only by productivity, but by the small ways they restored dignity to those around them. The stranger's presence was not a spectacle attached to posters or paid sermons. It was a lived memory that asked nothing of them other than a better response to suffering. One evening, some weeks after the incident, a small group gathered in Roberto's kitchen. Neighbors, Jorge, Alejandro, with a bag of tortillas in his hands. They ate, they laughed awkwardly, and for the first time in months, the house felt full not only of need, but of companionship. Alejandro and Roberto sat on either side of the table and spoke in humble terms about mistakes and about the work to come. Alejandro, his voice roughened by remorse, said simply, "I acted like a man who feared weakness. I now see weakness is where we are most human." He did not demand gratitude. He asked for trust and promised to earn it. The promise was not a miraculous contract. It was a vow to learn, to pay for missed wages, to change schedules, to speak when cruel policies were suggested. It was the beginning of a long road. The project site went on. Others fell and found help. Not everyone was healed. Not every wound closed quickly. But the pattern of response had been altered. People had been reminded by a quiet miracle that dignity was not a commodity to be revoked for convenience. It belonged to every human by virtue of being human. In the weeks that trickled into months, the story of the 70-year-old man who had carried 100 kilos and been humiliated circulated beyond their corner of Guadalajara. It passed between buses and market stalls and was told with varying embellishments. Some told it as a cautionary tale about bosses. Others told it as a testimony of compassion. For those who had been present, the truth remained simple and quiet. A stranger showed up when a man needed to be seen, and the ripple made a small, steady difference. One afternoon, Roberto walked to the small bench in his front yard where he and Maria Elena had once planned their small joys. He sat and traced the grain of the wood with his fingers, thinking of what had changed. He felt his wrists steady when he lifted a small plank. He felt no miracle anthem swelling around him, only a humble gratitude, like a cup half full on a kitchen table. He was tired, and his body still remembered strain, but there was a brightness to the days now, a neighbor who stopped to check on his hands, a note of apology from a man who had once been a tormentor, a son in the process of finding his way back. That evening, as the sun folded behind the roofs, a quiet voice inside him rose in a way that felt like prayer. It was not a plea for grand rewards. It was simple, thanksgiving for the one who had come. It was a whisper that said in many words, "You saw me." Friends, this is not a story that reads like a promise every time. It is a testimony of a moment when love showed up in a human form and changed the course of several lives. Miracles come in various sizes. Sometimes they are the closing of wounds, sometimes the bending of a proud heart, sometimes the rearrangement of community priorities. This is one such moment. If this story has touched you and you want to hear more testimonies of faith and hope, consider subscribing so we can share more stories like Roberto's. Stay with us because the world needs witnessers. If you are holding burdens right now, things that keep you small, things that chip away at your dignity, know this: your faithfulness, even in the smallest obligations you carry for others, matters. You are not invisible. There is one who leans in close and knows the names of those you love, and he meets us with compassion. If you would join me in a short moment, say these words silently with me. Lord Jesus, you see the ones who are overlooked. Bring your mercy to the places of shame and the places of hurt. Help us to treat one another with dignity. Give us courage to repair where we have caused harm, and give hope where despair has settled. Amen. If this story moved you, or if you have a testimony of a time when God showed up in the small moments of life, please share it in the comments. Type Amen or tell us what changed. Your words might be the miracle someone else needs to hear today.